Hello and welcome to the ANS podcast. I'm Steve McIntyre, Senior Urban Environment Consultant at ANS Global, and I work on the undeveloped potential to improve ecology and sustainability in our urban environments. As we've built up the cities and towns over the last few years, ecology has become less and less. So today I'm joined by Ash Welch, who's specialist in green infrastructure and biodiversity. We're going to be talking about the Biodiversity Net Gain and what this policy means for architects, what you need to know. And taking a step back, we're going to discuss the importance of biodiversity generally and how the Biodiversity Net Gain policy came through the Environmental Bill and is proving a valuable tool to architects, planners and consultants to navigate through the new updates, to actually get an understanding of what's coming from Natural England later this year. We're in a space where we've got to improve the value of ecology, we've got to improve our sustainability, and there's so much we can do together. So I'm going to just pass you over to Ash Welch now, who'll give a brief introduction of his position with AECOM. Thank you, Ash, and it'd be good to hear what you've got to say.
Thanks, Steve. Pleasure to be here. So my name is Ash Welch. I am an ecologist by trade, work for AECOM in the UK. My position is technically Green Infrastructure and Biodiversity Specialist, like you mentioned. And I guess my role is largely centered around Biodiversity Net Gain. So I do a lot of work around Biodiversity Net Gain on different development projects. But I also work on a lot of habitat design and creation. So working closely with landscape architects, engineers, and other disciplines to ensure that development projects not only provide for engineering sake or landscape sake, but actually for biodiversity and ecosystem services as well.
That's good, Ash. That's really what we want to focus on today, because the value of biodiversity is somewhat overlooked. So I just wondered what you could help us with your experience by working with biodiversity on projects.
Yeah, so I mean, biodiversity is a really important thing, and I think in the last few years it's really come to the forefront. I think it's starting to become at the front of people's minds when it comes to design. We've seen it with different cities. So if you look at cities like Singapore, who have really taken the biophilic concept to the forefront of design, and they're starting to integrate habitat on buildings and around the city. That message is spreading across the world, and I think people are starting to see the importance of biodiversity. And our urban places can play a role in supporting biodiversity and kind of helping the earth to recover. I think until recently, biodiversity has essentially been exploited by humans. And we've taken it for granted. So previously where we would exploit it for resources, now we're starting to understand and build in ways to understand how biodiversity helps us, largely through ecosystem services. So biodiversity, for example, does so many things that we take for granted. So it can, it oxygenates the air. Trees help oxygenate the air. They also help remove carbon, different habitats. There are a bountiful variation of pollinating insects and invertebrates, which basically pollinate all of our crops for us, which we take massively for granted. And so if the biodiversity crisis continues to go in a downwards trajectory, then a lot of these processes are going to start to falter. So we need to really do something for biodiversity. So and development projects are a good way to start doing that. So giving back more than what was there previously, for example. And also in urban areas, there's loads of research now to support that biodiversity is really important for our mental health and our well-being. So even just kind of subconsciously seeing greenery and hearing bird call and so on can really give us a good feeling inside. So it's really important at the moment.
That's very helpful, and interested the way you referred to biophilia linked with biodiversity, because it's really a value that, as you rightly said, is an opportunity with our developments to give back that value that we've really lost. So when you start looking at trees, you look at fungi, you look at plants, you look at animals, you look at green space, in our urban towns, in our cities, these were once, as you rightly pointed out, what we took for granted. So how would you help us now as an architect, as a planner, looking at a scheme, and how would you help us to sum up that value so that it's not overlooked in the next 10 years, so we start to make progress?
I think it's all about kind of taking a holistic approach. So, architects are going to work on a scheme, engineers are going to get involved at some point, and there's going to be a variety of different practitioners or consultants getting involved at some stage. I think what it is and what's really important is so biodiversity and sustainability are coming together and becoming one thing essentially. Whereas before, ecology, which was this bit, would have been kind of seen as a silo, and it would have been kept separate to sustainability. Now the evidence is so clear that what you do for biodiversity is essentially a sustainable practice. So it's really about joining up these processes. And I think the one thing that I would say is probably the most important is bringing all of those different disciplines together at the earliest stage possible, so that you can have a conversation about what's needed in a project, how you're going to achieve it, and so on. And just having that discussion at the very start makes everyone aware of what needs to be done. Making sure the engineers are aware, making sure the architects are aware, so that you can start to do something that is actually going to make a considerable difference for biodiversity.
That's really good. That really sums it up well, because as you mentioned, we've got these environmental challenges. So we've got oxygenating the air, removing the carbon, providing pollinators. And really, this is a value that we must ensure that developers and house builders and construction realize it as it's just as important as any other element within the construction industry. Which, do you think that's why the BNG has come about, to actually give an emphasis on this importance, do you think?
Yeah, possibly. It's partially probably that. I think, I think the main thing is that development has failed nature over the past, 50 to 100 years or so, or forever, you could argue, where we have these massive infrastructure projects and housing developments and so on. They kind of devastate nature to an extent. I know that sounds bad, but that is kind of the truth. What's kind of previously been done is that, ecologists would go to site, they would survey the habitats there, and then you would build up a kind of a qualitative case around the value of those habitats. But it's quite subjective, and whilst it was based on data, it doesn't always work. And I think you've seen that with a lot of these projects, is that whilst they're supposed to be doing more for nature, a lot of the time they actually fail to. And that's not necessarily the fault of the developer or the consultant or whoever, it's just the process. And I think now with Biodiversity Net Gain coming to the forefront, I think it's a change in that process. It's it's quantifying it, it's making it a quantitative process, which makes it easier for everyone, not just the ecologists, but people that don't know much about nature and biodiversity, to kind of understand it in a very simplistic way, which is comparing numbers. So it brings everyone on board, and so I think initially the reason it's kind of come about is the desperate need for some sort of change in the development process.
That's really, really helpful, because it's making everybody in the industry, right from the concept design with architecture to going through planning to then delivering on site, it's making everybody realize the importance of leaving the site in a better state than before, of actually giving back, as we said at the beginning, something we've taken away. And it's very helpful, as you say, the matrices that are being set out, the guidelines, and it's really another element of the planning, would you say, that and the development of ecology, to actually make sure that the BNG is respected and taken into account. So would you say the aim of the BNG is to really become an authority to help everyone become on the same page? Would that be a good way of putting it? What do you think?
Yeah, quite possibly. I think the way I always think about it is that biodiversity tends to underpin sustainability, tends to underpin the environment. Everything about the environment is linked to biodiversity, is linked to wildlife and nature in some way. And by enhancing that and improving that, you are intrinsically benefiting all those other things that we have to care about, like sustainable practices. So, your simple example would be, if you put up a living roof or a living wall, that's going to cool the building, that's going to have knock-on sustainability benefits, not just for biodiversity. So it's thinking about it in that way, not just thinking about things in silos like we all used to, and working kind of separately. We all need to kind of come together and do it that way. So, I mean, biodiversity net gain, I think the definition is something like development that leaves biodiversity in a better state than before. And taking that into a kind of a quantitative approach, I think is really important going forward. And that's being driven by the Environment Bill, which I think you touched upon earlier, Steve. Which, I mean, we can talk about that a little bit later. But that's the real key driver at the moment, and that's the policy driver for driving this forward.
That's good. And do you think it helps us then realise the interaction with other sustainable elements? You mentioned green roofs, you mentioned living walls, and then we can start looking at confines of the areas. We can look at rain gardens, we can look at bioswales, and then we can actually look at our natural resource, because rainwater and flooding is a big issue in a number of our regions throughout the UK. And actually, if we start focusing on that resource, that precious resource of rainwater, and bring it all back into a sustainable scheme, it can really add value to the whole development. So can you say a little bit, Ash, as to how it works, how we can bring this all together, this elements of rainwater harvesting and various ecosystems and living walls and green roofs? And because we know that the substructure of the ground is getting more and more congested with underground services. So we are limited with depth, but we've got scope to develop around the perimeters and in the confines of the site, haven't we?
Yeah. Space is at premium, right, in urban areas, especially in places like central London, central Manchester, and so on. You can't hope to have a development that's going to have loads of stunning landscaping and semi-natural habitats everywhere, because it just isn't the space to have it there. So what tends to happen on these sites is that there'll be some existing kind of greenery. So there might be street trees, you might have a bit of grassland and so on. And the development is such that it has to be, it has to provide it for so many things. And at the time, the high-rise buildings that take up the entire footprint of that site. So in essence, what you're doing is you're losing all your baseline habitats. So it makes it really tricky then to, like, how do you put them back? So Biodiversity Net Gain, the philosophy is that you follow the mitigation hierarchy. So you try and reduce the amount of habitat loss as you can. And then once you've kind of gone through that process, then the next step is to try and to offset it. So ideally you want to do that on site. That's the first step, try and do it on site. And including all that, kind of providing all that habitat on site is great for the people that are going to be living, working, or using those facilities and those bits of infrastructure. So it is really important. I think we need like equity or equality of ecosystems and habitat, access to green space and so on across the population. So it's really important that it's kind of placed in the development as much as possible. So yeah, going back to that example with the limited space, if you are really limited and you've lost some habitat in your baseline and you're going to build a high-rise building, it's really tricky then to understand where you're going to do it. You can't create a grassland, you can't create a woodland, you probably can't create a pond. So you're really limited. You might be left with a few street trees. There's not much you can really build into the ground at ground level. So you have to start thinking outside the box. And that's where things like living roofs and living walls, which can like essentially replicate some of these habitats that we've spoken about, come in really, really handy. And like you said, Steve, they can be used to benefit other things, other ecosystem services. So rainwater harvesting. And basically what you can do is to design a sub-strategy within that development using these different features without the need to even think about using ground space. So it's just approaching it in a completely different way to how people would have approached it before. Having those early discussions again with different disciplines. So if you are looking to create something like that, it all needs to be linked up. It needs to be good for biodiversity, but it also needs to be designed with whatever kind of function you have in mind. So if it's stormwater drainage, there needs to be lots of vegetation on there, which is able to percolate the water at a slower rate to stop kind of flooding events at the lower levels. So it's all about taking that mindset, bringing the ecologist in, bringing like stormwater drainage engineers in, and starting to design it with everyone on board.
That's really important what you just flagged up there, Ash, is that designing it with everyone on board, because what we've proved and the value of green infrastructure, the value of sustainability and ecology and improving ecology can all be achieved, but design and getting it designed right from the beginning is so important. And understanding policy, understanding legislation. Could you say a little bit where we are now with the policy and the new release of what's coming through?
Yeah, of course. I guess maybe a little trip down memory lane would help for a bit of context. So Biodiversity Net Gain, I mean, back in a while back, it was always, like I said earlier, it was this qualitative approach where you basically, so you might have heard, I mean, many people might remember, especially ecologists, consultant ecologists, where they've looked through local planning authority planning policies and stuff. There was always, in quite a few local authority planning documents, there was always reference to Biodiversity Net Gain, but never really, no one was really ever sure what it really meant because there was no way to quantify it. So you might have seen that it would have said, the development needs to achieve biodiversity net gain. And what would end up happening would be that a consultant ecologist would put in their report a handful of recommendations of how the site could achieve a net gain in biodiversity. But it was always very subjective and based on just some simple baseline data. So you might put some recommendations for bat boxes or bird boxes, and so on. So kind of what has happened since then is, I think in 2012, DEFRA put together a pilot to test out a quantifiable mechanism to assessing biodiversity. So basically looking at habitats, giving a value to each habitat. So a woodland, for example, would be of higher value than an amenity grassland because it can support greater amounts of biodiversity. So each habitat is given a value. And then there are a number of other coefficients involved, things like habitat condition, the strategic location of that site, and so on. And then basically using those coefficients, each habitat is then assigned a number of biodiversity units. And then those biodiversity units can be compared from the baseline with whatever you're proposing in your post-development scenario. So that's the concept. And DEFRA kind of brought that all together in a pilot in 2012, which was known as DEFRA Metric 1. Some people might know it as the Warwickshire metric. And that was trialled in a number of counties across the UK. I think in Warwickshire was the most notable one. And since then it's been developed on. They've had feedback provided. And since then, Natural England has taken on the reins and they've devised something called Metric 2.0. And that's the one that's been in circulation for the last couple of years and has become the industry standard. What's happened since then is the Environment Bill came around. And there are a number of different things in the Environment Bill, one of which is the mandating of biodiversity net gain. So it will be basically the Environment Bill is, biodiversity net gain, once the Environment Bill receives royal assent through Parliament, it's currently being debated in Parliament at the moment, there will be a mandatory effort to ensure that biodiversity net gain is achieved on all developments through the Town and Country Planning Act in England. So it's only relevant for England at the moment. It's likely in the future that different legislation will be adopted in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and so on. But at the moment, it's only relevant for England. So Metric 2 is out there at the moment, and Natural England are actually revising Metric 2 and producing a new iteration called Metric 3. And we suspect that will be released in the spring. It has been delayed a little bit, so we're not quite sure where that is at the moment. And the same goes with the Environment Bill. It's not yet passed through Parliament. It's not yet received royal assent. So we don't know when Biodiversity Net Gain will become a mandatory requirement through the planning process in England yet. We suspect it will be this year at some point. I hope it's this year. But unfortunately, because of the pandemic, things have slowed down a little bit. So we just have to kind of wait and see where that takes us. But what I would say is that delay isn't really stopping the way the Biodiversity Net Gain is developing. So clients of all kind of development clients of all sorts are starting to adopt Biodiversity Net Gain. And I would recommend definitely that if you're working on a development project and you've heard about Biodiversity Net Gain, but it's not yet been adopted for your project, I would fully recommend getting it kind of undertaking a Biodiversity Net Gain assessment as early as possible, because if the Environment Bill does become law, then there will be a future mandatory requirement for it. So once the Environment Bill does pass through Parliament, there will be a period of a couple of years for local authorities basically then to adopt that policy. So what we'd would expect in the next couple of years is for different local authorities to adopt it at different times. Some local authorities have adopted it already in advance of the Environment Bill even being passed through Parliament. So Cornwall Council, for example, adopted it locally as policy last year. So all developments going ahead in Cornwall already have to adopt Biodiversity Net Gain. So my recommendation would be to, if you are working on a project, check out your local planning policies and make sure that you understand whether it's required yet. And if it's not, I think my recommendation would be to get ready.
That's very helpful. And that's something I think that's really important that we understand as architects developing schemes, that the environmental policy, the environmental bill is going to happen. It is going to become mandatory, and we should be making preparation for it now. As you say, some projects can go on for a long time. You know, we know what is working with projects for 2, 3, even up to 5, 6 years or more before they're actually delivered. And so what we want to do at this point is see the advantage in looking ahead, so that we make these provisions. So when we look at a scheme, we look at it with a much broader range view, as you said earlier, looking at how we can improve the space. So do you find that architects have stumbling blocks? Do you find they have challenges when they start to apply this policy? Because the policy is set out, the matrix is set out. You might say that the roadway to BNG is clearly paved, and there's lots of signposts that we're getting and being shown. But what do you think the stumbling blocks are that are coming through?
So I guess one thing I haven't mentioned already is that as part of the Environment Bill, through the planning process in England anyway, there will be a requirement of 10% to achieve a 10% uplift in biodiversity. So 10% biodiversity net gain. So that's one thing that everyone's having to think about at the moment. So in terms of what architects kind of experience, I guess, some of the issues they encounter, is trying to achieve that 10% and knowing how to do so. So, and this isn't just the case for architects, but even like for ecologists and landscape architects and engineers, like knowing what habitats to specify in your proposals, which are going to get you that uplift in units, especially on these urban developments where you've got a limited land space. It's quite tricky. So do you use street trees? Do you use grassland? Do you use living roofs? Do you use living walls? Do you use subs features? Do you go for more semi-natural habitats or more kind of innovative artificial habitats? It's really tricky. And so knowing what is best to use in terms of the biodiversity units it's going to produce is quite tricky. So that's one thing. And knowing what the most, I guess, cost-effective options are as well. Cost is always one of the biggest drivers, I find. And it tends to be one of the reasons why biodiversity is forgotten about. So I always try and approach things from a cost-effective manner in terms of biodiversity. So what is going to produce the most for biodiversity? And so it's knowing those different things, I guess. And that knowledge isn't really out there at the moment. I think it's going to take a good few years for people to gain that knowledge. and understand as they start going through the net gain process. But it kind of applies to all sort of practitioners and architects. So that's the big things. I think overcoming that is the biggest thing. But again, it comes back to the idea of coming together at the earliest possible point and working on your design together.
That's very good. Working with a design. And I noticed you mentioned cost there, which is something that as developers, as developing schemes, we've always have to take into account. But when we're looking at design, it's important that we actually look at the systems as well, isn't it? And look at substrates, because an organic-based substrate can achieve value. It can achieve as a habitat for the insects, solitary bees. It can create wildflowers, can have natural self-pollination. All these kind of tips we can apply when looking at schemes. So understand what you say about cost, because it's very important. And a lot of our projects are cost sensitive. But if we look at the value of at the design stage, we can bring it in other directions. Do you think? What would you have any tips on applying green infrastructure and meeting these requirements?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point about substrate and soils and stuff. Really good point. Something that, a lot of people forget about. We always focus on what's above the ground, but what's below the ground is sometimes the most important thing. Even if you're working on a living roof, understand what the soil is and the substrate you're using and how that's going to kind of curate the habitat that you're looking to create is really, really important. So yeah, one tip would be think about ecology in a holistic manner. Think about all the different things. Don't just think about the plants. Don't just think about the habitat, but think about the things it's going to support as well. So like you said, Steve, understanding what substrates are great for different types of pollinating insect is really important. So looking at kind of, brown roof concepts and building different substrate and building different mounds and contours, providing different aspects and moisture. It's all about that variation and providing loads of different ecological niches for different things. So yeah, other tips, I guess, I come back to it all the time, but work collaboratively, that's the key one. So involve everyone from day one. I always try and set up a meeting between, so at the moment working on Biodiversity Net Gain projects, not all different disciplines, practitioners, architects are aware of it. So it's having that conversation with whoever's leading on the project, making them aware of it, and then disseminating that information so that you can come together in a meeting and discuss it. Get everyone on the same page. That's the most important thing. Because if you get everyone on the same page, then you can drive forward some really good results. You might have in your minds what's going to be great for biodiversity, but then there'll be other disciplines. There might be engineers talking about, we need this for drainage purposes. We need that for this. And so you work with it. So like we said earlier about the stormwater drainage example, if the scheme needs that, work with it. Ecology, biodiversity can work with these things. Use it to your advantage. It just kind of changes the way that you design things. The next thing would be, remember to follow the mitigation hierarchy. So when you're designing something, always try and retain any habitat which is of good biodiversity value. So anything that has a distinctiveness, and distinctiveness is a term which is used in the biodiversity net gain metrics, basically the value that habitat provides. So a woodland, for example, tends to have high biodiversity value. Immediate grassland will have low biodiversity value. So always try and retain any woodland that's there, always try and retain any good grassland that's there. Wetland features, if you can retain them, then great, only lose them as a last resort, because they're the things that cause you to lose biodiversity units really heavily. And they'll impact you when you're trying to achieve the net gain. And then the next step is thinking outside the box, especially in urban areas. Use that holistic approach we spoke about a moment ago, and think outside the box. Think innovatively. There's so many interesting kind of innovative habitat solutions out there now, which you can use. So, living roofs and walls and suds features, bioswales, rain gardens, all of these sorts of things. Some of them can be really aesthetically beautiful, but also provides really well for biodiversity. So use them to your advantage. And And when you're designing them, don't just design a bog standard one. Think about the function of the habitat. What's its function? Is it going to be for stormwater drainage? Is it going to be to try and help you remove air pollutants? Or is it just for biodiversity? Maybe it's a couple of those. Use that as the way that you then go on and design that habitat, and make sure you get some biodiversity value in there as well.
That's really helpful advice. And I think as we start these developments, start these schemes, we should list down our drivers, carbon sequestration, air purification, pollination, ecology, put these subheadings down, and then look at what's, as you say, there's so many creative opportunities by using nature, and then put them in a subheading under those titles and see what we come up with. It's amazing how we can design some schemes. I mean, some of the schemes we've worked on recently have been so enthusing. Perhaps you can give us a bit of an overview. I think you've worked on some schemes. Just give us a brief how you've proved by getting the drivers set out, how you've managed to develop the increased in ecology, etc.
It's really interesting how design on developments is changing, so especially since people have started to become aware of Biodiversity Net Gain. Everyone's aware of it, and everyone kind of realizes it's now, it's going to be a mandatory requirement, so we have to do it. So everyone comes in, everyone pitches in, and it's really nice to see. I think there is still quite a bit of that to do because not everyone's aware of it, but I think once everyone kind of is aware of it, you will get this much more collaborative approach. Everyone's on board and kind of allows you to do a bit more interesting biodiversity habitat design at the start, the very initial stage of the project. So, I mean, what I've seen on a number of projects now, I mean, one springs to mind is we've worked on a redevelopment of a market in East London, one of these large food markets where they trade different kind of foods. Yeah, if you can imagine it, I think it's near the Thames. It's an old Docklands site. And the footprint of the site was, so the baseline, I think it has street trees, a bit of amenity grass and so on in it, semi-improved grass in it. And as you can imagine, some of these large kind of warehouse style markets, they're pretty big. They have a big footprint. So it takes up pretty much the whole site. So you've only got kind of an outer strip on the outside of the site where you could do some landscaping. I think I was initially kind of brought into the project a little bit later. So this just, again, proves the importance of bringing everyone in at that earlier stage and having this collaborative approach. Because otherwise you do encounter problems and sometimes you have to go back to square one and redo the design. So I came into the project, there was a little bit of landscaping on the outer edges, and then the design kind of evolved and they realized they needed car parking spaces around the edge, which meant there was even less landscaping around the edge. And the scheme was we did the Biodiversity Net Gain assessment, and based on those proposals, the scheme was going to come out at quite a hefty net loss in biodiversity. Because they just weren't putting enough back. Basically, there was a massive roof on this building with some really nice kind of structural frames around the edge, structural columns, which meant there was a really nice opportunity to do some interesting stuff with kind of ivy trellises, ground-based green walls, and going up these columns, and then also on the rooftop as well, potentially integrating a green roof of some sort. So we went back to the drawing board and we worked with the landscape architect and the engineers. I mean, the structure was kind of there already, was built in already. A little bit of extra redesign of the roof had to be done to accommodate a green roof. But in the end, it wasn't too bad. We all got through it. And in the end, part of that roof was essentially accommodated a living roof that had been designed for wildlife. I think it was an extensive green roof, so lots of wildflowers, kind of interesting features for pollinating insects and so on. And it's next to the Thames, so hopefully over time, different habitat will be created down that stretch, and you have a nice corridor, and it'll really benefit for biodiversity. So in the end, it came out a really nice positive net gain over the 10% mark, and everyone was eventually really happy. But it's that important thing, we can save a lot of time and effort by getting everyone involved at the beginning, having those discussions, and really the ecologist leading that discussion and helping everyone understand what's required to 10% net gain target. So that was really a really good project to work on. I mean, in the end, we didn't even need to use the entirety of the roof, the market roof, to achieve net gain. So it just shows how these different features, these different systems, urban green infrastructure habitats can be used to benefit net gain.
That's a brilliant example, Ash. Really inspiring to think that, we can take an area in East London, in the Docklands, and actually bring back the BNG. I've worked on projects in Barking where we were able to bring back some of the old traditional wetland plantation species onto the roof of the building. So some really great opportunities. And I think one of the challenges we're all facing is that there's, as you said earlier, not everyone is all on the page yet. Not everyone's got a full understanding. So we've been working together, haven't we, for several months now, putting together a guide, and it's a simple tool to look at best practice and how to look at developing and delivering the most effective ways of improving ecology. And I think if we all embrace it as architects and planners and designers, ecologists, and then we can take it to the developers and the construction industry and say, this is deliverable because we've got a guidance, we've got a tool to follow. Would you say some more about that? What would you say, Ash?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm really looking forward to it being published. I think it's going to be a really useful piece of guidance. But I would say before I just mention it, there is some really so Natural England who Metric 2.0 and are going to be releasing Metric 3.0 this year. They have some guidance out already, which basically runs you through how to use the metric and the different parameters that you have to play with. So we're kind of, if you like, building upon that, and we're focusing with our guidance note on urban green infrastructure habitats. So Metric 2 and Metric 3.0, they use a habitat classification system called UK Habitat Classification. And within the metric, you've got a number of different habitat categories for urban green infrastructure. So you've got different living roof habitats. I think you've got brown roof, extensive roof, living roof, and intensive living roof. You've then got living walls, and you've got two categories for those. You've got facade-bound green wall, and you've got ground-based green wall. And then you've got a number of different sustainable drainage categories as well. So there's urban sods, bioswales, and rain gardens. I think to the average person, it's quite difficult to understand the differences of those unless you've got really good technical expertise like you guys have at ANS around how you design and build these systems. Most people, myself until probably a couple of years ago, and that's only because I'm really interested in these systems, didn't really have much knowledge of them and didn't really understand what the difference was between each one. So we kind of help you make we kind of provide really nice illustrations and definitions as to what these different systems are, how they differ, and we try and illustrate it. So it's really easy for you to understand. So basically, it gives you a helping hand into knowing what habitat category to use when and where, and also allows you to kind of start to understand what it is that you're actually designing in terms of the kind of biodiversity net gain terminology. We also provide some really useful comparisons between the different systems. So, when should you use an extensive green roof, or when should you use an intensive green roof, or maybe you should use a brown roof? What's the difference? What's the difference between them, and what is the when is it most suitable to spec one of these and compared to one of the others? So we tried to provide that sort of comparison to allow kind of consultants and architects and so on to make informed decisions about what they're designing, and we start to tie that in with the biodiversity units that each of these systems produces as well. So there's a coefficient called habitat condition, and so the habitat distinctiveness, which is the value of the habitat, and the habitat condition, which is essentially the relative value of that habitat. So, for example, one extensive green roof might be better than another extensive green roof. So the better one would have a good condition, the lesser one would have a lower condition. And that kind of impacts the amount of biodiversity units created. So we start to break down this data in a kind of really easy, digestible format so that people can just pick it up, kind of go to the section they're interested in. We've laid it out really nicely. So you've got a whole section on living roofs, a whole section on living walls, and a whole section on sustainable drainage features. It will be a kind of an infographic style document. So really visual, really easy to pick up and just find the information that you're after. Gone are the days, I think, where we have really long text-heavy reports where you have to sift through, find the information you want. So that's what we want it to be. We want it to be nice, easy to use, user-friendly. And yeah, pick out this detail, understand what it is that you're speccing, when it's best to use these different systems and how they can help your development achieve biodiversity net gain, essentially.
Yeah, that's really puts it out clearly, Ash. So it's really a tool that's going to help us to be compliant with the BNG and look at all the options. So as we said earlier on, we're sympathetic with each other because it is a challenging subject, BNG. There's lots to understand, and there's, as you say, to some who haven't had the time to look into it, it can be very confusing. But what we're seeking to do, and what this guide will do, is to show a pathway. It will give options so that when we start designing right at the beginning, we can bring this value in. You know, it will help us become appliance, help us to look at what's most suitable to that location. You know, understanding what the driver is, as we said earlier, understanding, you know, what we're seeking to achieve out of that site to the maximum BNG result. You know, it's getting to the 10% better state than before. Maybe we can exceed that on some projects, and without increasing cost. And this is what's so important. So when we release this, which will be later this spring, it will enable architects to actually look at the options that are available, and between ourselves and ANS Global and AECOM, we can advise and give proven information as to what is going to be a long-term sustainable solution, because longevity is also key with sustainability. With what we develop, what we design, we want to be there in 5, 10, 20, 30 years' time. You know, it's changing the future. So this is really how the tool will help, won't it, to become much more compliant, do you think?
Yeah, it will. I mean, especially those urban developments with limited land space. I think they're the key ones, like, you know, where you're really limited with what you can do. Our guide is going to give you a template of how you can achieve or go towards achieving your net gain percentage or target. Like I said, if you can go above and beyond that, always look to do that. Don't just use the number as a target. Always try and go above and beyond. It does kind of future-proof you in doing that, because if you do come back and update the design, what I find in a number of different projects is you're just on the brink of 10%, and then some other kind of engineering-based aspect of the design has to change, and suddenly you're then dropping below 10%. So the higher you can reach, definitely go for it. Definitely. I mean, in terms of compliance more generally, I mean, it will help, especially if you're in England and your planning application is going through the Town and Countryside Planning Act. It will comply with that. And as local authorities start to adopt it, they'll start to appreciate that. In different countries, I mean, like, so I just want to pick up on a couple of the other countries. So Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. At the moment, there is no kind of like policy driver for net gain per se, but there are some large corporations who are starting to adopt biodiversity net gain as policy. So National Grid, for example, is one, and where they work UK-wide, they apply it into different regions of the UK as well, different countries of the UK. So it's not just an England-orientated thing. It is developing everywhere, and I think the earlier you can adopt it and start to think about how you can design things for nature and use them to your advantage, that's what we should be doing, and eventually we'll get there, and all of our developments will be a lot more sustainable.
That's very, very good. So as you said, you know, it's a revolving circle. We've got the matrix 3, aim to be released, as you mentioned earlier. There's other countries are doing their own connecting policies. So we're actually all on the same page, bringing ecology, bringing nature, and actually providing for our future. And I think that's what we really want to sum up today on Biodiversity Net Gain. It's not about the now, it's about the future. And we've got to start planning for the future in our designs, in our architecture. We can't just keep putting more and more concrete down and forgetting, as you said right at the beginning, the ecology, so forgetting the natural, what belongs to the UK, what belongs to our countries, what belongs globally in our ecologies. So it's all about putting this out right from the beginning at the design stage. And this tool will guide us, will show us how we can implement these changes without incurring massive additional costs, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to cause massive costs. I mean, when we're starting to see natural capital become a thing, which is the quantification of nature more widely. And the more that becomes a thing, I mean, a lot of these systems are going to be seen to be really cost effective. They're nature-based solutions at the end of the day. And nature-based solutions provide not only for ecology and biodiversity, but they provide for us as well, our economy, society, and so on. So the more we think about these things in that kind of more holistic way, the more we value these things, I think. And less we start thinking less about the initial cost, and we start thinking more about the long-term cost effectiveness, I should say.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because it's going to be right. It's going to provide for, it's going to remove air pollutants from the air. It's going to sequester carbon. It's going to do this. It's going to do that. And the more you think about those things, and the more you start to value those things, then the more these things become more cost effective.
I think that's really important. I think we should ask ourselves the question, really, how much does nature, how much does ecology really mean in the terms of value? How do you put a price on it? It's so important that we take this forward and realize the value of ecology in sustainable design. Ash, it's been great having you on today for this session. I think it's been really useful. Have you got anything else you think we should add?
No, it's been great. I really appreciate it. So cheers. Thanks for having me.
Well, a big thanks to you, Ash, for joining. And I found it really inspiring. And please reach out to us, ANS Global. Follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram for updates to when the best practice guide will be published. It will be in the spring. We've almost completed it. So register an interest and be free to reach out to me too. My email address is steve@ans.global. Reach out to us. We're happy to share our experience. The more we share, the more we can do together. Is that right, Ash?
Yeah, definitely. That's it. Come together, work together, be collaborative, and we'll save the planet together.